Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the ARCO Forum. I'm Charles Royer, Director of the Institute of Politics, which is sponsoring the Heffernan Visiting Fellows Program, which program has brought us our speaker this evening. The Elizabeth B. and Dennis B. Heffernan Visiting Fellows Program was established in 1975 to bring to the Institute for a brief stay individuals who have distinguished themselves in public life so that they might interact with members of the university community. One of the very best things about the Visiting Fellowship, in my view, is that it is almost totally conceived and carried out by members of the Institute's very hardworking Student Advisory Committee, almost all of whom are very hardworking undergraduates. Would you please just recognize and help me to thank not only the Student Advisory Committee, but the chair of the Institute's Visiting Fellows Committee, Mark Moffitt. Mark, where are you? Now, to introduce our speaker tonight, it's a real pleasure for me to recognize still another member of the Institute's family, Professor Shirley Williams. This morning, when Sir Geoffrey met with some 20 Kennedy Scholars and Knox Fellows from the United Kingdom, Professor Williams was there to join in the discussion. There I was, a Tory cabinet minister on one side, our speaker, and a Labour Party cabinet minister on the other, the estimable Shirley Williams. I was more than a little nervous. This is not exactly like your city council meeting. The level of discussion was high and inspiring for one who loves politics, whether it be the British or the American variety. We are so fortunate, all of us, to have Shirley Williams here at the school. Since 1988, she's been Public Service Professor of Electoral Politics, has served as Acting Director of the Institute of Politics, and is a member of our Senior Advisory Committee. Shirley served in the British Parliament as a member of the Labour Party from 1964 to 1979, and again as the first elected member of Parliament of the Social Democratic Party, of which she was a co-founder. She was elected twice from the SDP, which she served as president from 1982 to 1988. Among many other activities, Professor Williams is the energy and inspiration behind something called Project Liberty, which is a Kennedy School-based effort designed to help the newly elected and appointed leaders of East and Central European countries cope with the very great problems posed by the transition from a command economy to a market economy. So please welcome, for the purpose of introducing our speaker, our own and our own right honorable Shirley Williams.
Charles, Sir Geoffrey, ladies and gentlemen, it would be very tempting tonight for Geoffrey Howe and me to simply reenact one of the more attractive scenes from the House of Commons Question Time that many of you see on C-SPAN on a Sunday night. And indeed, we could do, I think, a very good attempt to try to reproduce that in real life. But that's not the point of my introducing Sir Geoffrey Howe tonight, and it's a real pleasure for me to introduce him as one of the leading figures in the House of Commons over a period now of some 25 years. His life and mine have intertwined at various stages. For example, in 1964, we were both elected in that same year to the House of Commons. We both belonged to the class of 64, a class in his case with no ending, in my case with an ending in 1983. We both became subsequently, though he first and me after, secretaries for prices and consumer protection, a particularly tough job in which you are blamed for everything while the Chancellor of the Exchequer actually makes the serious decisions. You are a kind of fall guy or scapegoat for everything that goes wrong. Sir Geoffrey Howe was elected, as I've said, in 1964 by the constituency at that time, I think, of Reigate, which subsequently became called Surrey East, and he's represented that seat without a break for 26 years. He entered the cabinet in 1972 in the administration of Mr. Edward Heath, and then was elected to subsequently to, or at least appointed to the cabinet again in 1979, when he took up the extremely senior post of Chancellor of the Exchequer, roughly the equivalent of an American Secretary of the Treasury. He served in that office for 4 tough years, leaving in 1983 to become Foreign Secretary, and he served as Foreign Secretary until 1989, when he became Deputy Prime Minister and Leader of the House. But his period in office and his period in politics lasts over a much longer period than that. And if I may, I would like to read to you something that was said by Bruce Anderson in the book, the biography he recently wrote of John Major. For the last quarter of a century, the dominant strand in Conservative Party thinking has been economic and social liberalism. Sir Geoffrey Howe is entitled to much credit in propagating these ideas from the 1950s on. And indeed that is true. Geoffrey Howe was one of the leading figures in the Bow Group, one of the earliest of the Conservative think tanks, and unquestionably his philosophy, his ideas and his attitude stamped a generation of Conservative thinking. It's also true to say that Geoffrey Howe has been one of the people who has been an architect of Britain's relations with the European community, in which he has played an extremely significant part. But to end on a slightly lighter note, and I was going to make the comment that having crossed from Taubman, I was already a wet, I should perhaps conclude by what a diplomat said of Sir Geoffrey Howe's relationship to Margaret Thatcher. He described them as the violin and the chainsaw. It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce a thoughtful, distinguished and elegant player on the violin.
Well, thank you very much, Shirley, for the kindness of that introduction. My thanks, too, to the school for the kindness of this invitation. You would not expect one sparring partner to follow another who has made a modest mistake in her introduction, to allow that to go unnoticed. Because, in fact, did suffer an intermission in my parliamentary career. It's quite right that Shirley and I were elected into Parliament for the first time in 1964. But I, too, lost my seat in 1966. I was elected for Bevington on the banks of the Mersey, where at least one beetle was born. And when I lost my seat in 1966, I had to return to practice at the bar. I will remember sending a telegram overnight to my clerk in my chambers in the Temple, saying, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" But it's good also to be given the opportunity of speaking before, under Shirley's auspices, an audience of such predominant, although not universal, youth. Because it reminds me of an occasion when I was fighting my second election in my hometown of Port Talbot in South Wales in 1959, which always taught me that life in politics lasted longer than anywhere else. At that time I was some 33 years old, and I thought I was enormously mature and developed. And my Labour opponent, who went on to become Secretary of State for Wales, was 29 years old, and my Plaid Cymru Welsh nationalist opponent was 30 years old. And at the end of the count, we were scrutinising the spoilt ballot papers to see for whom these misleading documents were intended to be cast, as though it actually mattered against a Labour majority of 18,000. But there we were scrutinising these things, these three mature, confident political figures. We found one ballot paper with no cross against any name, but filled in by a profoundly disillusioned antique coelacanth-like Welsh voter, who'd come out of his cave to write from one corner to the other of the ballot paper, "May the best child win." But it is a special hazard for any speaker when the moment comes for responding to an opportunity that is or was unexpected, like having to make a resignation speech, for example, or almost as bad as on tonight's occasion, when the opportunity turns out to be more challenging than originally expected. So if my thoughts turn out to be less ordered than you might have hoped, certainly I hope more thoughtful, more surprising, please forgive me. Several reasons for that. First, because having started preparing my talk in the expectation that I should largely talk about Thatcherism, or mainly that, I find I need to talk about conservatism more generally. Why, you may ask? I think the answer is because on the British, if not the Anglo-Saxon scene, one has to acknowledge that conservatism is a more durable, more substantial and more real object than any more personalised creed. That's a slight blow to my amour propre, because I was the author of a high watermark tribute to Thatcherism when I spoke at a party conference and said that compared to Thatcherism, all other isms were now wasms. But I think I always had a private reservation in favour of conservatism. But if in France, where there's no conservative tradition in our sense, if in France even Gaullism is slowly fading, then I think one has to acknowledge that Thatcherism also will not turn out to be a durable creed. I'm the last person, of course, to deny its existence as a phenomenon to which I was perhaps exposed and with which I was involved as long and as closely as anyone, which perhaps, as Shirley indicated, I helped to create, to sustain and manage, and eventually perhaps to curtail. A phenomenon of unique energy and quality, and undoubtedly of historic importance, but not a creed. So let me try to assess the impact of Thatcherism upon conservatism and come in due course to ask how far Thatcherism illuminated or changed conservatism, for the better or for the worse, and how far, through conservatism, it affected the fortune and the future of our nation, even the world. I think it's right to consider it in that way because of the nature of conservatism. T.S. Eliot, writing in the Literature of Politics in the mid-1950s, said that the principles of the Conservative Party are not based, as are those of more ideological parties, upon a body of doctrine, perhaps a canonical work, a programme based upon the doctrine which will lead towards some final state of society, where theory precedes the practice. But they're based upon an opposite process, where the party had a history before it became fully aware of its own permanent tenets, which will probably be found only by careful examination of its behaviour throughout history. So, as David Willits of the Centre for Policy Studies has recently been pointing out, the present debate about Thatcherism is characteristic of the Conservative Party as being only the latest example of a debate about ideas being conducted around a particular person. And the question is often asked, did Margaret Thatcher promote the takeover of the Tory party by a band of ideological foreigners from Hayek to Friedman? Or was she restoring the mainstream tradition of the party by repudiating the crypto-socialism of Ted Heath? I think that alongside those questions, this concept of the Tory thought process as being geological rather than ideological, rooted in the generally unreflective attitudes of the ordinary citizen, the party of the silent majority, can be quite comforting, or it can be quite debilitating or worse. If it exposes the party, for example, or the entire body politic, to gradual takeover or immobilisation by a wave or successive waves of intellectual activists, ideologically driven. So the Conservative Party has always sought to resist that danger by thinking of itself as the party of balance, that strives to lean rationally and sensibly against an unwise fashion of the day. In the 19th century, against laissez-faire. In the 20th century, against socialism. A party that can sometimes, and must sometimes, be mobilised in support of some move to change or correct that balance. If one has that analysis, I think it will be seen that Margaret Thatcher, Thatcherism, fits into that tradition, restoring or shifting the balance of the party, rather than, as some people would argue, destroying an inheritance, at a time when restoration of the balance on a substantial scale was well needed. Now, to sustain that analysis, let me trace for a moment or two the way in which that balance can be seen to have shifted. One starts, and why not, with Adam Smith in 1776, and goes through Burke and Liverpool and Peel. One sees a period of 7 decades dedicated pretty consistently to the end of mercantilism, to the promotion of economic liberalism. And one can conclude that Victorian prosperity was the subsequent fruit of an explicit long-term programme of deregulation, liberalisation and tax cutting over several decades. And certainly that was the period in which the worldwide economic success of the British Industrial Revolution bore fruit. And it's worth remembering that, again, my native land, Wales, in the third quarter of the 19th century, was as important to the world energy market and the importance of Welsh coal production as Saudi Arabia was 100 years later. That the iron and steel industries of Britain at that time were producing the predominant share of those commodities worldwide. So that was the fruits of long-run consequences of economic liberalism of that kind. Then some people would say there arrived Disraeli in the third quarter of the 19th century, presenting, movingly enough, the one-nation case. Some people seeing that as antithetical to the market principles that had gone before. But one asks whether it really was in opposition to or an antithesis to that. Or was he just establishing the social half of the 19th century social market economy? Because still underlying the impact of Disraeli's policies, there was adherence to the gold standard and stable currency, adherence to the notion of a balanced budget, and to the principles of free trade. Thereafter, the tide began running in the other direction, certainly from the beginning of the 20th century. And we had a long period of perhaps 40 years of liberalism, Fabianism, socialism, moving in an international setting where Marxism was making its way, towards a different balance within the British body politic, and therefore in the Conservative Party. Wartime planning in two successive wars, the growing role and importance of expertise, of elitist expertise, of Webbist and Coleite expertise, the development of our own nomenclatura, and of course being carried forward by the growing strength of organised labour, a point which Shirley referred in one of our talks this morning, when the Liberal Party in 1906 passed the Trade Disputes Act, giving the first substantial protection to the trade unions. Organised labour and labour votes represented about 60,000 people. By 1945, that number had grown to 12 million people. And one goes through a long period in which there is a progressive shift of the same kind in the intellectual balance of the Conservative Party. Stanley Baldwin consciously acquiesced in the corporatism that followed from all of that. Harold Macmillan, writing The Middle Way in the mid-1930s, and I quote just one sentence, said that the weaknesses of partial planning are errors of limitation. We must advance more rapidly and still further upon the road of conscious regulation. When that was followed by the wartime coalition and the Attlee government, one sees that the British body politic had had a full half-century all moving one way. Now, what happened from 1947, 48, 49 onwards? At that time, there began, actually, the reaction within the Conservative Party and the body politic that reasonably can be seen as foreshadowing what Margaret Thatcher subsequently set in hand. It wasn't always seen as such. There were periods between 1949 and 1979 when the Conservative Party was, to borrow Shirley's words, still wet. When Macmillan was Prime Minister from 1958 until, say, 1965, and during the period when the Heath government, of which I was a part, reverted to interventionist policies in its last 3 years, that was a period in which we remained to the wet side of the point of balance. But from 1949 to 1958, the move towards a restoration of economic liberalism actually started when Harold Wilson, as a Labour minister, lit the bonfire of controls. And the Churchill government's cry in the 1950s to set the people free was part of that swing back towards a more liberal economic position. From 1965, when Ted Heath took over the leadership of the party, until 1971, and in the 1970 manifesto of the Conservative Party, written in caricature by Selsdon Mann, the Conservative Party had in fact already moved its point of balance well to the economic right and in other respects. And indeed, the intellectual thrust that Shirley was talking about, that we tried to generate within the Bow Group during the 1950s and 1960s, the intellectual thrust of the One Nation group, which spread from Ian MacLeod to Enoch Powell, the message that economic change is our ally, the fact that the Bow Group was founded explicitly to combat the influence of the Fabian Society, and en passant, to make the Tory party fit for observer readers to live in. The impact of the Institute of Economic Affairs, founded in the late 1950s, all those things were seeking to tilt the balance of conservative thinking back towards the right-hand side of the analysis. There was, in fact, in the end, no sustained change in that direction until Margaret Thatcher arrived. For two reasons, I think. Partly because of what has been described as the ratchet effect, the extent to which, over many years, each step towards more public ownership, more regulation, more nationalisation, remained unreversed, and the extent to which the common ground of British political thinking was, to a large extent, that defined by the progress in the leftward direction. Now, that was the background against which the Thatcher government came into office. And it came into office, of course, at a period when there was profound disillusion with the impact of the policies of the then Labour government, the kind of disillusion which led to the birth of the Social Democratic Party in due course, when people were very conscious of the need to check and then reverse the long-run economic decline of our country, and when Sir Nicholas Henderson, our ambassador in Paris, wrote a dispatch in that year describing in graphic terms the extent to which Britain was seen as the sick man of Europe. And the policies which we then began to put into place had been worked out and defined under Margaret Thatcher's leadership from 75 to 79, along the lines originally foreshadowed in the 1970 manifesto of Ted Heath. Sound money, energetic supply-side reform, end of price control, income control, dividend control, exchange control, free or at least responsible collective bargaining, extension of monetary policy from the IMF regime imposed upon the Labour government to the medium-term financial strategy that we introduced. Incidentally, it's interesting to know that when we first presented the disciplines of the medium-term financial strategy to Margaret Thatcher, she was not easily persuaded of it, because her instinct made her reluctant to accept what she called graph paper economics. I mention that as an insight into the caution with which, in fact, she reacted to new thinking of that kind. But we did carry it through, together with a major package of tax reform, with a widespread series of reforms of the labour market, and at that stage, a privatisation programme that was distinctly modest. Now, we identify there, I think, the first distinguishing feature of Margaret Thatcher's impact upon policy formation and implementation. Whereas we were elected upon a manifesto very similar to that on which the Heath government was elected, Her Majesty's government under Margaret Thatcher's leadership did stick to the certainties of self-imposed economic discipline. In 1958, the Macmillan government had not. Macmillan had accepted the resignation of Thornycroft, Powell and Birch. In 1971, the Heath government had not. And I commended that central quality of Margaret Thatcher's administration in a speech I made in Blackpool a couple of years ago, when I said, fundamentally, it is this which I believe has given Margaret Thatcher's government a special quality, and overall, and perhaps above all, a sustained sense of purpose. It was that determination that was the first distinguishing feature. And it's worth saying, en passant, that a similar determination was displayed, and people may not have recognized this, by Jacques Delors as France's finance minister after the early faltering years of Mitterrand socialism, when he attached firm economic policies to the discipline of the European exchange rate mechanism. You need firmness of that kind to implement successful economic policy in tough circumstances. And I shall always remember the support that I received from Margaret Thatcher at the time of my 1981 budget, which was, as I can now feel free to say, the most unpopular of all my budgets. It was the budget that tightened taxation substantially when we appeared to be moving into recession conditions and had done for some time, because we recognised the overriding necessity to secure effective control of public sector borrowing. It was the budget that provoked 364 economists, unusually, to agree and to write a letter to the Times proclaiming my budget as the beginning of the biggest disaster to end all disasters. And when they wrote that letter, that was at just about the moment at which there commenced 8 consecutive years of the strongest economic growth in British economic history. It's why I've always taken a jaundiced view of economists and applauded the definition, which describes an economist as a man who knows 364 ways of making love, but who doesn't know any women. At all events, following that, the impact of these distinctly Thatcherite economic policies, because she gave the backing at that time of difficulty to those policies, we did get inflation down dramatically from a high of 22% to a low of 2.6%. We did reduce the tax burden on incomes and earnings and enterprise from a high of 98% to a low of 25%. We did that at the price of a substantial increase in the tax on expenditure, which we had always advertised in advance. We extended, as the years went by, our program of privatization, so that in the end we privatized 29 major companies, more than half of the former state sector. And we carried through this long program of trade union reform. Step by step, under Ted Heath's leadership, I'd been responsible for one Big Bang Industrial Relations Act. Margaret Thatcher followed it through in 3 bills in place of 1. And by 1990, there had followed a very important social switch, because the number of trade union members in society had fallen from 12 million to 8 million. The number of shareholders had risen from 3 million to 9 million. That social change was accompanied by important economic changes as well. The number of strikes per annum reached the lowest level for 55 years, and fewer days have been lost to industrial action in each of the last 5 years than in 2 months of the last winter of the Labour government. And as I say, the gross national product grew steadily for 8 years from 1981 onwards. Productivity since 1980 rose by 60%, more than any other major industrialised country. But, alas, earnings growth never fell below 6% per annum. Contrary to many people's beliefs, welfare spending, far from being ruthlessly restrained, because of the growth in the economy, enjoyed substantial real growth as well. On the health service by 43% in real terms. In education, partly because of the falling numbers at school, an increase of 42% real terms per child at school, and comparable increases in the social services. Now, that's the background against which we were able to secure re-election with a very substantially increased majority in 1983 and a modest reduction in 1987. What features of Margaret Thatcher's method can I identify as contributing to that? First of all, I've said tenacity. Then I would say the ability to choose the right issues with the right sense of timing, to be selective as well as ruthless. We did tackle public spending early on and made some very difficult and important decisions which held back the growth of that. She did enable us to identify the right public sector strikes to resist and the right circumstances in which to do so. We found ourselves in the end resisting the Scargill-led strike in the coal industry, and in that way winning a battle that had to be won, that Harold Wilson and Barbara Castle had tried to fight, the battle that Peter Jenkins in his book identified as the Battle of Downing Street, the battle against undue trade union obstruction. We chose, or she chose, the right sequence for privatising large companies like British Leyland and British Steel. Her second gift, I think, was a particular style of very effective populist advocacy, the right way of challenging unreasonable militancy, the right way of commending the switch in the tax structure from taxes on earning to taxes on expenditure. She had a particular skill in self-presentation, which enabled her, with the support of the media, to personalise the success of her government's policies and to achieve some degree of insulation between herself and those policies that prospered less well. So that, for example, our failure to tackle the coal strike in 1981 effectively led to the replacement as Secretary of State for Energy of David Howe, and he was seen as carrying the responsibility of that, rather than the Thatcher government as a whole. So too the return of inflation during Nigel Lawson's chancellorship. I think she was able to sustain the right kind of economic policy mix in terms of supply-side measures to liberalise the economy, and, most importantly, to recognise the wisdom of basing counter-inflation policy not on incomes policy, but on a monetarist foundation. We all of us, of course, played a part in that. The monetarist foundation for our policy against inflation was laid by the Labour government under Dennis Healey and Jim Callaghan to designs specified by the International Monetary Fund. And the only difference that we made was not to try to supplement those with an incomes policy. But that had a most important wider political effect, because in the 1970s, the lack of any link between the Conservative government and the trade union movement was seen as a Conservative problem. How can the Conservatives manage these people if they don't have that link? By moving to a different approach, whereby the success of counter-inflation policy didn't depend upon the acceptance of an incomes policy, we reversed that sequence. So by the 1980s, the existence of a powerful link between a putative government and the trade union movement was seen as a problem for Labour. So in the 70s, the lack of the link was seen as our problem. By the 1980s, the strength of the link was seen as a Labour problem. And Margaret Thatcher's endorsement and advocacy of monetarism was the key that broke that union veto on that element of policy. And the union link within the Labour Party, plus the excessive militancy, was in a sense the trigger for the birth of the SDP. It was the trigger for the long decade of divided opposition, and it laid the seeds of change within the Labour Party. What about the impact of Thatcherist policies overseas and on the perception of the United Kingdom overseas? They undoubtedly had the effect of erasing the Nico Henderson impression, and Britain was no longer seen as a sick man in the latter years of Margaret Thatcher's leadership. The United Kingdom has always had the need, as a medium-sized power, but nevertheless holding important positions in the United Nations, the need to box beyond our weight. We have less economic strength than some countries of comparable population. So if we're to make the best of our position, you need to have a government that can exploit the opportunities that present themselves in the community, in NATO, in advocacy with the United States, in our permanent membership of the United Nations. And Margaret Thatcher was able to maximise the advantage that Britain could gain from those footholds of influence. The Falklands factor, which made her such a strong perceived leader on the international stage, coupled with our perceived economic success, enabled us to make a major impact on serious agenda items of the European community. The reform of the budgetary structure of the European community would not have happened without that. The commitment of the European community to the 1992 single market programme would not, I think, have happened without that. And the steps that have been taken, substantial although still quite inadequate, towards the reform of the common agricultural policy, owe a great deal also to Margaret Thatcher's impact. One can see, and I have so many memories of it, the extraordinary effect of the recognition factor that accompanied her around the world. To come as we did, for example, to the Williamsburg summit in 1983, to go with her on her first visit to Tbilisi in Georgia, to go anywhere in Venice, to go with her on her first visit to Peking. No political personality was ever recognized with the same dramatic force and response as she was. Of course, that owed something to her position as a woman, manifestly more recognizable than anybody else, but also the radiant confidence with which she communicated with crowds of every nationality and kind. That enabled her to have, and Britain to have, a specific impact in parts of the world where it might have been surprising. The relationship that she struck up, for example, with Zamora Machel of Mozambique is not one that would strike the world as a natural bond of affection. But he played a key part in helping to bring the Zimbabwe-Rhodesian independence negotiations to a conclusion. And I can remember going with her to one of the Soviet funerals in the mid-1980s and going up the steps to the reception room in the Kremlin where we were going to be greeted, I think, on this occasion by Gorbachev. And we were in a queue shuffling up the steps with Yasser Arafat not far ahead of us, but not someone with whom we normally communicated. And the early people coming down the steps as we were going up. And one of the people who came down was, in fact, Zamora Machel. And as he appeared, he saw Margaret Thatcher, and they bounded across the stairs towards each other, practically advancing into a public embrace upon the stairs in front of all these people. And one could see Yasser Arafat looking and saying, well, what's he got that I haven't got? But it was that kind of remarkable personal relationship which enabled her, by her advocacy, in the end very strongly, of the need to end apartheid, alongside her long-established advocacy of the case against sanctions, that allowed her voice to be heard perhaps more loudly than anybody else's in the inner citadels of Afrikaner power in South Africa. And it was that advocacy which we were constantly amplifying, coming from her, that did in the end, I think, play a significant part in the shift there. It was the fact that she had done all that that enabled her, on the day of Namibian independence, to move in and rescue what could have been a very serious state of affairs. You remember when the United Nations forces were being confronted on the ground by the forces of both sides in Namibia. Of course, there were downside factors to this dramatic posture on the international stage. Some press conferences, when, for example, the concessions made by the Commonwealth on sanctions were described by Margaret Thatcher as teeny-weeny, did not achieve the best presentational effect for the changes that had been made. But her influence through international contacts of that kind did spread very far and wide. President Assad, another figure who one would not regard as naturally responsive to her personality, nevertheless took strong notice of it. President Jaruzelski, Deng Xiaoping, all of them were leaders who reacted very positively to messages that came personally to them from Margaret Thatcher. And, of course, most dramatically of all, the impact that she had on the role played by Mikhail Gorbachev. The way in which, and I won't go through the story now, he came to London in 1984, before his emergence on the stage, and she was able to recognize his potential as a performer in the reform of the Soviet Union, as a man with whom we could do business, and the courage with which she sustained that relationship thereafter. So too, it must be said, the role she was able to play in communication with President Reagan of this country, founded upon the kind of support that her leadership gave at the difficult moments of conflict with Libya, enabled her to develop influence that on more than one occasion was deployed at Camp David, on the one hand in the direction of restraint in the SDI program and maintenance of the existing treaty structure, and on the other hand in defence of the nuclear element as a whole. In the Anglo-Irish field, I don't think any other leader, other than a committed unionist like Margaret Thatcher, could actually have taken us as far as we did get towards the Anglo-Irish agreement. Again, a downside factor in the European community when the chemistry sometimes went wrong. But net plus on almost all these fields. Was Margaret Thatcher then a world trendsetter in promoting economic liberalism in this kind of way? Or was she merely an exponent of the British version of this world trend that was going to happen anyway? It's like asking, would perestroika have happened without Gorbachev? Would the coup have ended without Yeltsin? I don't think that these things would have happened on the scale which they did without Margaret Thatcher's catalytic role. Her catalytic role certainly in restoring the United Kingdom's self-confidence and in helping to open the eyes of people in Eastern and Central Europe, in helping to set the pace for change within the European community. But it must be acknowledged, of course, that her vision, and who can wonder at it, was less than 2020. Even overseas, in the end, some of the negative aspects of her presentation probably laid the seeds of her own decline. The balance that is necessary in the modern world between nationalism and internationalism was not always well judged. And if one looks at the same propositions on the United Kingdom scene, she certainly saw the long-term need to tackle a wider agenda as the government was prolonged in office. But I think her touch became less sure as time grew by. Less sure, perhaps, because she was temperamentally more at ease in winning battles rather than winning arguments. And the concept which is necessary in statesmanship, particularly international statesmanship, but even in national leadership as well, of coexistence, the recognition that nations live together in an indissoluble marriage, that national leaders and their people have the same unbreakable bonds, was a concept that was not, I think, perceived quite as much as it should have been, particularly the necessity within the European community to live not only within an indissoluble marriage, but an indissoluble polygamous marriage, which is a particularly difficult relationship to sustain. Even so, Margaret Thatcher led us to start a fresh agenda, which is still unfinished and still important. The reforms of the legal profession that were set in hand, the onslaught on professional restrictive practices, were ones that Ted Heath would have wanted to do, but never was able to sustain the initiative enough to do so. The changes that are still taking place controversially in the National Health Service, the need to challenge the rigidities of this inherited structure for the sake of the professionals as well as the patients, was something that, again, Margaret Thatcher saw had to be put in hand. Whether there was a sufficient vision at the same time of the need to consider the available resources alongside the large gap in the percentage of GDP spent on health in the United States and the United Kingdom, I think is less clear. She also was able to bring to real life the great debate on education, which actually Shirley Williams with Jim Callaghan was starting some 15 years before. And we have seen changes there as a result of the impact of the Thatcher government as well. The broadcasting industry, where Margaret Thatcher was always preoccupied with the impact of monopoly, certainly there has been changes there as a result of her impact. I wonder, though, and here I think Shirley Williams would agree with me, whether there was insufficient realization of the wisdom of the observation by the French statesman Thiers that the first requirement for statesmanship is indifference to newspapers and also television. Another area where a major impact was made was in the field of local government. But I wonder there whether the instinct was not misled by the impact of militancy, which in Liverpool did harm and may have unduly discoloured the appearance of the institution more generally. So from those causes, there were, I think, features about Thatcher governments which contained some of the components that were to lead to Margaret's eventual departure from office. A tendency to narrow the base of support, following from the insight that it was important to win battles and not arguments and not friends, led to a reduction in the base of allies and peers and of the recognition of the need for them. No doubt, certainly, the commitment to the poll tax in place of the rating system. And thirdly, the return of inflation, as I would think, as a consequence of the reluctance to recognise that when the medium-term financial strategy was no longer working, the European monetary system provided the framework of discipline that could have prevented inflation coming back. Now, those, I think, were the central reasons why this glittering record of success finally began to fade away. But if one forms a long-term judgment, it must surely be overwhelmingly positive. She did set the framework for a new millennium. She has shifted the common ground, and the Labour Party with it and onto it, not without assistance from another woman sitting beside me on the right there. She may even have helped to make the Labour Party more superficially electable. Certainly, she's played a decisive part in shaping the agenda for the next generation of British politics. And we're now looking at an agenda that is much less contentious and much more consensual than it was 10 years ago. Overseas, and I'm not sure how far Margaret Thatcher contributed to this, but I think to some extent, it's recognised that a British government, and certainly a Conservative government, must be outward-looking and cooperative, with a growing recognition of the need to work in and through a wider Europe if we're to maximise our influence on world affairs. I think that Margaret made some contribution to that, although less perhaps as the years went by. At home, there's a distinct and, I think, long-run emphasis on the need for sound finance, well-protected currency, alongside market liberalisation and supply-side reform. And in social policy, that too has become libertarian, with growing emphasis upon opportunity, choice and responsibility, the wider freedoms and higher standards of a prosperous society. I believe that in the result, parties will compete in the future around those principles, and that Margaret Thatcher has helped to shift the common ground and create a new broad-based political orthodoxy. And the parties that get out of line with that will need to justify their position. Has her kind of ideological leadership produced an end of ideology? In some areas, I think yes. There are certainly many new areas, of course, where ideology is out of place anyway. Environment, energy, ageing, international economic dependence, which don't divide conveniently between left and right. But insofar as there is an ideological element left, it's she and we who have to find a great deal of it. So many old dragons have been slain that many of the new problems have less to do with government than with society. And for the Conservative Party, having designed so much of the common ground, we need to avoid looking like custodians looking to the past, designers whose work is done. We need to be seen as energisers, modernisers and developers of this new order. So internationally, and here I think Margaret Thatcher's perception was limited, we do need to continue responding positively to the growing significance of Europe and the destiny of our nation. So economically, we do need to hang on to the stability that comes from our membership of the European exchange rate mechanism. We need to sustain the cause of supply-side reform, above all in the labour market, in continuing to secure better control of pay inflation, and in continuing to advance the education of a better trained, more adaptable workforce. And in social policy, we need to emphasise the case for rising standards, more choice, for the humanisation and not the privatisation of the social services, to make it clear that we're not forcing people to be free. All this requires us to learn the technique of managing radical change, which Margaret Thatcher mastered for so long. Radical means fundamental. Radical means far-reaching. But radix, of course, means a root. And without roots for radical change, the change will wither. It's no good our just, therefore, recycling notions of change that have found few buyers in the past. We have constantly got to secure the ground of advance for change of the right kind, step by step, following Balfour's advice that democracy is government by explanation. We need to remember, perhaps more than we had done recently, that no turning back cannot be interpreted as the same as bash on regardless. Political leadership consists of the ability not only to shape the agenda to the national need, but to shape the management of that agenda to the national mood as well. Politics, and above all Conservative politics, depends upon getting that balance right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, so could I ask anyone who's got a question to please line up at the microphones? I can't very easily see up there, so if there's anybody up there, they will need to wave their hands in the air. Let me start on the right.
Thank you. Sir Geoffrey, it's nice to see someone here with, I presume, no interest in the Democratic presidential nomination. I wondered, though, if you might indulge my provincialism for a moment and tell me what links, ideological or otherwise, you find between Reaganism and Thatcherism. And for those of us who bemoan the demise of neither Mr. Reagan nor Mrs. Thatcher, do we have reason to fear a more radical reincarnation of either?
Well, I'm surprised at the lack of courage on the part of such a young man.
It's in the spirit of the occasion
hang on,
today.
You've asked your question. I'm allowed to deal with it. I think that radicalism is a necessary component of political leadership, but it's got to be prudent radicalism. I think that's what I was trying to say in my closing remarks about the need to make sure that you're putting down firm roots for radical change. I think the changes we've introduced in education are a good example of changes that have already begun commanding a wider support. I think the changes in health may be of that kind, but if so, they haven't yet been deployed and advanced sufficiently well. As to the comparison between the policies of the Reagan government and the Thatcher government, I think that the instinct that was most powerfully shared was the instinct that it was necessary to mount a strong defense against the threat that came from the Soviets. And although one could argue about indeed, I think I would never have been at ease with an evil empire type rhetoric. I think the kind of rethinking that took place coincidentally when George Shultz went to the State Department and I was at the Foreign Office did enable us to open up a much more constructive and joint approach to the handling of the Soviet Union and East-West relations. And insofar as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan endorsed and gave authority to that approach, I think there was a common and an extremely worthwhile aspect about it. I think that the one area where I would draw the sharpest distinction between Reaganomics and Thatcherism is in the handling of government borrowing. When we introduced our direct tax cuts in successive budgets, we always did that upon the basis that we were going to increase pay-as-you-spend while we were improving pay-as-you-earn. We never succumbed to the beguiling doctrines of Lafferism. We were followed in that tax switch from taxes on earning to taxes on expenditure by the Labour Finance Minister Roger Douglas in New Zealand. And for me, the most astonishing contrast between the two is that while I was reducing dramatically and with great difficulty our budget deficit in 1981, so that we were able to get our budget into balance and surplus in the years that followed, helped of course by North Sea oil, but before that happened we were clawing down the deficit. The United States has been able to sustain a budget deficit on the enormous and I think unforgivable scale that's happened in the last 10 years. Alan Greenspan and I spoke jointly to the New York Economic Club in 1980 or 1981, and he didn't then hold the exalted position he holds now. I was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. And each of us, with suitable discretion, said then that to continue borrowing on the scale then in prospect was going to do damage to the world economy as well as that of the United States. And when people now ask the question, is the budget deficit going to harm the economy, the answer is that that harm has been done. Not irretrievably. If the world's richest economy, now with the world's largest debt, still with the world's cheapest gasoline, actually begins to pay as much for its gasoline as every other country does around the world, and begins in that way to begin clawing down the budget deficit, then the damage done by the budget deficit will be undone over time. That's, to me, the most important distinction, absolutely fundamental, because as a result of that, the accumulation of private capital, the investment in innovation, which should have been taking place in this strong economy, has not been taking place, and the people, taxpayers of future generations, face a very substantial burden because of the deficit. So the time for starting to tackle that, even in today's circumstances, is now. And I think that's the most important distinction. We nearly fell into the same trap in the last 3 or 4 years, but we're determined once again to get out of it.
Sir Geoffrey, I was disappointed in your analysis of Thatcherism that you didn't mention the unemployment levels in the early 80s, the inner-city riots, the demoralisation in our schools, the demoralisation in our health service, the fact that Thatcherism has given values to the rich people in our country, which says that's negated their sort of social responsibility to the poor. Sir Geoffrey, is it not right that the whole root of the whole raison d'etre of Thatcherism was to tie a constituency to the Tory party and forget the rest?
Well, I forgot, what was the last line?
Is it not right that the raison d'etre of Thatcherite thinking and the whole policy behind it was to tie a constituency to the Tory party, woo them with share issues, with Bupa and things like that, and say forget the rest? I mean, it just seems to me that Thatcherism's written off a whole sector of our population and has got little to offer them.
Yes, I think it's interesting that everyone who makes that kind of critique of Thatcherism always spoils what is not a very strong case by overstatement. The fact is that no responsible political leadership would dream of seeking to secure re-election or dream of seeking to tackle the problems of the country by following the kind of insights that you described. Of course there are problems with declining inner cities, and the problems of declining inner cities are in no sense novel to the United Kingdom, in no sense unique to the United Kingdom, and they require great skill in tackling them. But it's quite wrong to judge Thatcherism by that aspect of them. The fact is that the economic policies followed in the last 10 years have enabled us to sustain a real and substantial growth in expenditure, as I said, on the health service, on education and on the social security budget, 43%, 42% and 33%. Whereas the unsuccessful economic policies of the Labour government that went before did not enable us to achieve just that. Of course there are things that need to be corrected, as there are in any pattern of behaviour. But I do not think that you can justly describe Thatcherism in the simple style that you did. But
well, if you let me come back, I mean, I've heard many ex-Tory ministers and Tory ministers now discuss Thatcherism in these quantitative terms, but it's the qualitative terms you've got to look at. The level of demoralisation in our society, you know. Okay, I mean, you know...
well, let me see, I didn't pick you up on two things, but you talk about the level of demoralisation in the schools. The fact is that the most important deficiency in Britain's educational system, as Shirley was pointing out when she was in that department, was the decline in the quality of achievement, which had been continuing for a long time. We have made changes in the Baker Education Act of 1988, establishing the importance of a core curriculum, establishing the importance of outside testing of school achievements, establishing the importance of governing and managing bodies that are more responsive to the needs of parents, establishing school management of their own budgets. All those changes are now regarded as acceptable by the Labour Party. And there is a universal recognition that the decline in basic standards of literacy and numeracy are the things that have to be tackled. And schools on the whole are now increasingly glad that they are being tackled. I think the only complaint that I find from schools when I visit them now is that the agenda that they've had to face has been thrust through too quickly. But there is a real sense of relief that they are being tackled. Now, one can deal with other things as well. But I think that you see an unduly jaundiced view. I don't want to sound unduly chirpy about it. Of course there are problems. But I think that key changes in direction have been made, which are will prove advantageous.
Next question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about the glittering successes of Thatcherism in two areas. Firstly, the economy, and secondly, on public spending. Because you talked about there being 8 years of unrivalled growth. Now, that was between two recessions that were unrivalled since the Great Depression in the 30s. And it seems to me that for an economy to go wildly up and then wildly down again, and it's more of a roller coaster than a business cycle, can't be healthy for any economy. And if you look at the full 12 years since 1979 and look at growth over that period rather than simply the 8 years in between, then growth, the average annual rate of growth during that period was 1.75%. That was a response from a Treasury Minister. Now, 1.75% is not only lower than all other countries, our other major competitors during that period, it's also lower than the average annual growth rate of the previous government since the war. Now, that doesn't seem to me to be much of an economic record. Also through a period where manufacturing investment has only been through 2 years higher than it was in 1979. And at a time where the OECD in the summer, in their analysis of the economies of all the major G7 countries and the EC countries, put Britain at the lowest growth rate, the lowest job creation, lowest level of investment, and in their forecast predicted that it would stay at the lowest rate of growth for the next couple of years.
Can we perhaps...
That was basically what I wanted to do, was get you to respond to. I mean, I'll skip the public spending to let somebody else ask that question. But could you tell me how you can justify 8 years of success, of wonderful growth and a wonderful economy compared to those figures?
Well, by repeating and retorting the lesson in selective statistic mongering. Of course, if you choose the OECD report of last summer, at the end of the current year of undoubted recession, then they are quite right to complain about the UK economy's performance during that time. But for a whole string of years before that, they were commending the structural changes that had taken place and regarding that as part of a long-term change in the performance of the UK economy. I've acknowledged, of course, in the statements that I've made, that the return of inflation in the late 1980s was something that is much to be regretted, and I think happened because of our failure to recognise that with monetary aggregates becoming very difficult to measure, we should have moved ourselves onto the European exchange rate mechanism basis for the regulation of monetary growth. We will soon be returning to a more effective and disciplined management of monetary growth as we adjust ourselves to ERM membership. As inflation comes down, as it has done dramatically, we shall then find growth resuming again. The fact remains that the 8 years of growth that followed the successful changes in the early 1980s were a longer and stronger period of economic growth than any during our history, and that it's only by adding at both ends, as it were, the two recessions and putting that period together that you arrive at the particular figures you do.
But surely the Thatcher government should be judged on its full 12 years and not just the 8 years you choose to judge it on.
I'm not judging it on... I'm not judging it on 8 years. I'm judging it on the whole. And I think that almost all independent commentators agree that the changes made in the structure of the labour market, the changes made in the structure of the tax system, the huge changes made in advanced productivity and by privatisation have fundamentally altered the potential of the economy to perform well by comparison with what the position was in the early 1980s.
We have the question on the left. Thanks.
So, Geoffrey, you've mentioned some policies with education, and you've alluded to a drop in literacy rate. Could you describe some of the Thatcherite policies towards higher education in terms of universities and polytechnics, and try to rationalise that in terms of the so-called brain drain, whereupon we have many professors such as Shirley Williams coming to America and sharing their wealth of knowledge rather than in England, and students also coming over here?
Well, I'm definitely not to be too offensive, since I'm not really...
I was going to question whether Shirley was a brain drain. I wasn't going to question whether she was a brain. But I don't think she started life as a professor, so to speak. Actually, she's blossomed in different circumstances. But let's get too personal about it. No, I think that probably the most significant change that has been made in the tertiary educational structure has been the extent to which the universities have now turned outwards in their search for resources and in their management of and in their search for objectives. I think I speak about ones that I know a little, but Surrey University, which was a new university when we started, Salford University, also the same vintage, and even the London School of Economics, all of them are now, I think, managing themselves in a fashion closer to the best of American university management, recognizing the need to get into research relationships with local industry and economic activity. Of course motivated by the need to enhance the resources that they're getting. And I think you'll find that the kind of technique which John Ashworth applied in Salford University, initially to the accompaniment of great reluctance in face of the pressures being put upon the university system, are now being applied more widely and more successfully, and being applied with welcome in the London School of Economics, which has anyway had a pretty good record. So I think that I'm sure we still do need in the UK to secure a substantial improvement in the numbers staying on into higher education, and we do need to secure a very substantial improvement in the basic attainments of the primary and secondary school system. And I think that probably that's been the longest standing shortcoming of our society for a very long time. There's a book written by Martin Wiener. I never remember the title of it precisely, but it's about the social policy and the industrial society, which traces a curious shortcoming in our educational system, which appears to have disdained the link between education and wealth creation, and appears to have steered us almost unconsciously away from the success of a modern industrial society. And I think that Shirley, when she was in the job, began opening that agenda item. I think that it's only recently in the present government that we've really addressed it properly.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, Sir Geoffrey, if I could ask you about the rationale for the poll tax, and also if you could give your appraisal of it, because it seemed to kind of smack of a kind of a cunning plot against Labour councils. And it also seemed rather suspicious that it was introduced in Scotland a year in advance of its introduction in the rest of mainland Britain. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, the poll tax was one of the tax changes that we considered when I was at the Treasury between 79 and 83. And when Michael Heseltine was at local government. We published a green paper considering alternatives to the rating system in 1981, and in 1983 we published a white paper reaching the conclusion that for the foreseeable future the rating system would remain the basis of local government finance, and I should have preferred the matter to rest there. Michael was at the Ministry of Defence and I was at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the renewed attempt to replace the rating system developed actually for Scottish reasons. We all thought that we had laid to rest the original pledge in 1974 to replace the rating system by that white paper. But when Scotland had to face the consequences of revaluation of the rating system in 1986, I think, the hubbub as a result of that change in the tax base in Scotland was such as to lead our Scottish members of Parliament and our Scottish ministers to say, look, you must re-examine this wretched thing. And that provided the political thrust which reignited the intellectual search for something different. I think that it was the wrong conclusion to draw. I think that all finance ministers have inscribed on their heart the legend that an old tax is a good tax and a new tax is a bad tax, because the consequences of change are always worse than the benefits as advertised. But curiously, it was the Scottish anguish that led it to be the place where it was first designed and first introduced. I think that it underlines actually another message, that the rating system fell into decay because of the frequent postponement of revaluations, and the tax base became less and less realistic. And we can blame successive governments for that of all parties, I think. It would have been better to keep the rating system in working order, to extend exemptions as far as necessary, than to move to the poll tax. It wasn't designed as a means of coercing Labour councils. I think that it probably was driven by the excesses of a handful of militant Liverpool-type loony left councils. And I think in retrospect we should have been wiser to allow that minority of badly performing councils to reach their own conclusions in whatever misery it involved, because there has now been a return of municipal responsibility, which I think is the way in which we should have preferred to see it going on.
Thank you very much. A question over here, and then a final question here.
Yes, sir. I was wondering if you could please comment on, firstly, on domestic policy. And in light of the change in leadership, how do you see the Conservative role changing in light of privatization, particularly the privatization of utilities, which got a lot of coverage in the Thatcher era, and particularly with the NHS, the so-called privatization of the NHS? And secondly, how you see the British role changing in light of changes in the European monetary system and the exchange rate mechanism. What do you see as Britain's role in the future in that, not only in light of the lack of the dichotomy between Thatcher and Delors now, but also in qualified majority voting? How do you see the impact of that upon the British stance?
I think there are, maybe there are two questions.
Right.
Is the candidate allowed a choice, or does he have to answer both? No. On the first one, there is no question of privatisation of the National Health Service at all. What there has been is the introduction of changes which make it more management-orientated rather than fossilised and institutionalised. And I think you will find that those changes, although complex at the outset, are being and will increasingly be accepted. What they do is to give those who work in the service a better chance to manage their working environment in a more sensible fashion. And they will, I think, introduce more flexibility and, in the end, a better quality, better value for money. There still remains, of course, the great question, is the totality of resources being devoted to the service more or less than it should be? And that will be a continuing part of the debate. But I think you'll find that a lot of the rest will be regarded as acceptable. Privatisation more generally, I don't think you will find any disposition to reconsider the privatisation of utilities. There's only the railroads and the coal mines left in effect, and I think that the coal mines will certainly return to the market in due course. The railroads, I think, probably require different treatment. But the other privatised utilities will remain in that form. I think that they will need further change, probably to demonopolise the regulatory structures and make them more flexible. But I think what's happened is that privatisation, for example, in the water industry, by separating the regulators from the providers, has demonstrated the need for much higher volumes of investment by the providers to reach the standards of quality that the regulators are requiring. And one of the consequences of keeping regulation and management and ownership in one public sector hand is often to defer necessary economic change and necessary regulatory change. So I don't see any case for a revision of the basic thinking there. As far as Europe is concerned, well, we could give it another whole speech about it, but essentially John Major is conducting European policy in line with the mainstream of British thinking as it has developed over the last 2 or 3 decades, recognising that Britain is inescapably within the European community, that if we are not at the heart of that, our influence won't be maximised. And that means being determined to make the most of the opportunities and being an enthusiastic participant at the heart of it, rather than a reluctant participant sometimes at the margins. There will still be difficult questions to resolve, and questions of the extension of majority voting, for example, I think will remain a point on which we shall be reluctant to see any significant advance. I don't exclude any advance, but I think it's important for a structure with the multinational, quasi-federal nature that the community has got, not to be encouraged to extend regulatory surveillance too far into the social and industrial life of member states. That's quite difficult to prevent. But I think that the vitality of different communities needs to be preserved. On the monetary front, my own view about the need for a single currency is clear. the major government is conducting negotiations, recognizing that as a legitimate objective, not yet committing itself to it. I think that's probably a sensible way of doing it. Margaret Thatcher was in the end inclined to speak so plainly as to make it clear that she excluded that as a legitimate objective as far as she was concerned. And that, of course, put in question our good faith in dealing with our partners about that question. It was one of the issues that was at the heart of my final disagreement with her.
Thank you.
Sir Geoffrey, I was struck by the omission as a list in your list of Mrs. Thatcher's accomplishments of the Sino-British Joint Declaration on Hong Kong. I wonder if you've, at any time since that declaration was signed in 1984, had occasion to rethink it or wonder whether you did the right thing or the party did the right thing. And also I wonder whether or how you would reconcile the party's stated objectives of economic liberalism and human rights with the forced repatriation of Vietnamese refugees from Hong Kong.
Well, I didn't omit it for any special reason, except I think because it was a rather specific example and because it was a topic with which I was myself directly and personally concerned and probably had more contact and more responsibility than Margaret Thatcher directly. But as far as the boat people are concerned, there is a choice for them of remaining indefinitely in increasingly crowded camps in Hong Kong, accumulating in tragic tens of thousands year by year, and I've been to the camps many times. There's no prospect of their being received anywhere else in the world. The United States and the other recipient countries have not been ready to receive any other than those who are categorized as genuine refugees. But the economic migrants have no claim, and nobody has recognized a claim for them to be transmitted on to anywhere else in the world. That is the position in relation to economic migrants everywhere else. Daily, economic migrants from mainland China into Hong Kong are returned to mainland China in their scores. Manifestly before our eyes, economic migrants from Albania to Italy are restored to Albania without anyone giving it a second thought. And the conclusion that has been arrived at in relation to the return of Vietnamese boat people to Vietnam is the only one consistent with the normal pattern of international law. It's been delayed so that the numbers have grown tragically by the reluctance of the United States, for understandable emotional reasons, to endorse it. A very large number of the Vietnamese boat people have arrived in the last year or two. Not even boat people, they're Vietnamese bus people who trundle by bus along the mainland and get into a boat for the last lap of their voyage. And they are no different from any other economic migrants who should return to their homeland. And that has been recognized, of course, by the international conference that has considered it in Southeast Asia since the agreement was arrived at 2 years back, before I left the Foreign Office, by all countries except the United States. And I'm glad the United States is now ready to concur in the policy of returning them to their homeland. As far as the Joint Declaration is concerned, I have no hesitations in re-endorsing the wisdom and legitimacy of that agreement. Nobody has ever suggested that any agreement can be made that can guarantee anything about future conditions in Hong Kong. If you have the world's largest communist society with 1.25 billion people, not renowned for the liberalism of its standards of government, pressing upon the world's smallest but most successful capitalist economy of 6 million people, in circumstances where the independence of the one could be snuffed out overnight, as it was by the Japanese in 1942, there's no way that any politician can produce a guarantee of the security of that way of life for the people who live there. Least of all, when the sovereignty over 92% of that territory in any event reverts to China in 1997. We were confronted with that situation, and we worked hard to establish the Joint Declaration, building on the one-sentence wisdom of Deng Xiaoping when he said what he wanted to see was one country, two systems. And from that sentence and about half a dozen other sentences subsequently spelt out, we built a comprehensive and complete Joint Declaration providing in detail for the preservation of the essential features of Hong Kong, which I won't weary with now. Now, the reason why we think that is likely to be upheld is because it is profoundly in the joint interests not only of Hong Kong but of China to uphold it. A huge volume of China's trade with the outside world takes place through Hong Kong. There are tremendously important and growing investment links between the two of them. The Hong Kong effect is spreading to the neighbouring parts of China, so that in the Guangdong province, for the last 10 years, there has been real growth at the rate of 12% per annum. And we believe that the successful economic example of Hong Kong will continue to commend its survival within the terms of the agreement to mainland China. And I see no way in which anything else could be done to enhance the prospects any better than that joint declaration. Of course, the joint declaration received a tremendous shock after Tiananmen Square, because that represented the worst demonstration of the kind of risk which it was designed to deal with. But it wasn't written for a fair weather future. It wasn't written for a foul weather future. It was the best we could do for all seasons. And I think that the joint interest of both societies in its success and survival, in the observation of an international agreement registered to the United Nations, with the whole of China's reputation and prestige vested in observation of it, is likely to secure its effective survival. And my most recent visit to Hong Kong gives me the impression that although nobody can be sure, and although people are seeking to take, if they can, precautions against the worst happening, nobody is now arguing that there's any scope for any significant change in it. And I hope very much that the United States government will not be led by an excessive zeal for the early promotion of fundamental reform in China to remove the most favoured nation status of trade with China. There is almost no way in which any outside agency can transform the pattern of government of a quarter of the human race. There's certainly no way in which sensible people in 6 million Hong Kong by agitation can change it. Hong Kong's best chances of securing the long-term acceptance is by the continued success of the example that it offers, and not by agitation. I think it's the best basis on which to do it.
It's a form of refined torture for a politician to be put in the position where he or she cannot comment politely in any way on what the major guest has said. And as you might imagine, I've been sitting in my seat constantly suppressing remarks I would love to have made. I only wish that the Kennedy School more often went for a...
I heard you saying here, here very much.
You heard me saying here, here. But I often wish that the Kennedy School would go for a debate formation more often than it does, because I would have so enjoyed a debate. But let me thank Geoffrey very much and just make one remark before I say one final thing about him. The one remark I would like to make, and Geoffrey wasn't here to hear Governor Clinton just the day before yesterday, but it strikes me very forcefully that tonight Geoffrey has been saying how we wouldn't dream of privatising the health service, and Governor Clinton, a Democrat, was saying over and over again that he wouldn't consider the socialisation of the medical service, and that says a great deal about the strange ways in which we use language in different countries. The concluding thought I want to give is this. Those of us who know a lot about British politics, and there are many people in this audience who do, will recognise that Geoffrey Howe's remarks about Margaret Thatcher were marked not only by a balanced approach to history, but also by an astonishing generosity of spirit. And I think that I want to put that on record in thanking him tonight.